My name is Cecile Gromas. I'm a founding member of Young Israel North Beverly Hills Synagogue. I'm an active board member and president of the Sisterhood, so you could say I'm extremely committed. Aryeh Green and I go back for many years when he was director of Media Central, and he's a good friend, and I've always supported all his amazing, heroic endeavors. So let me introduce your exciting speaker tonight, titled Reawakening Zionism, which we very much all need in our troubling times. Aryeh Green is the Vice President for Strategic Investment at Energia Global, an Israeli solar energy projects developer for Africa, and is Director ex officio of Media Central, a Jerusalem-based project of honest reporting providing services for the foreign media in Israel. Born in Washington, D.C., Aryeh grew up in San Francisco and has lived in Israel for over 30 years. He has been a policy advisor to Natan Sharansky and a business executive and consultant. He continues to be active in efforts to combat anti-Semitism and in Israel's public diplomacy, including serving as a briefing officer in the IDF spokesman's unit, as well as in promoting freedom and democracy in the Middle East. Aryeh holds a BA in psychology from UC Berkeley, an MA in international relations from Hebrew University, and a master's in business management from Boston and Ben-Gurion universities. What an egghead you are, Aryeh. A nerd, we call him a nerd. We like nerds. He was married just 2 months ago to Miriam, who's with us today. And they live in Beit Shemesh, the house of the rising sun in loose translation. Those of us old enough to understand that will get it. Those of us who are younger will not. And have 9 children between them. And when not promoting solar energy and accuracy in the media, Aryeh grows grapes and makes wines. Let's give him a warm welcome. He arrived here at 6 a.m. this morning. Aryeh Green.
Hi. That was a long enough introduction, I think, Cecile. Thank you very much, Cecile. I did arrive just this morning, although that was Miriam unfortunately is not with us. She will be with us in 2 days. But thank you for recognizing the new partnership that we've created together just 7 months ago. I want to begin, first of all, by apologizing before starting any of my more formal remarks. I'm very sorry for, just to reiterate what Aryeh said, for the slight delay in the beginning of our proceedings. Apparently there was a misunderstanding and different misprints regarding exactly when we were going to start. So for those of you who've been here for quite some while, thank you for your patience. And I hope you'll come and tell me afterwards that it was well worth the wait. I hope so. I want to thank also not just Aryeh Rivkin from the Jewish Activities Center of LA, and of course Cecile and the Beverly Hills Synagogue, formerly known as the Young Israel of North Beverly Hills, for co-sponsoring and hosting the evening. Also David Siegel, Carolyn Ben Natan, and the others on the team at the Israeli Consulate here in Los Angeles, who are our co-sponsors, as well as the Zionist Organization of America, Stand With Us, Roz Rothstein, who's the head of that, who couldn't be with us this evening, but very much stands behind everything that we'll be talking about tonight, and Rabbi Abraham Cooper, Rabbi Martin Heyer from the Simon Wiesenthal Center and the Museum of Tolerance as well. I just appreciate the real strong and wide support for the topic that we're going to speak about tonight, which I think says something about the topic and about the Los Angeles community. And there were others, even if they're not formal co-sponsors, who also helped to gather us here tonight together, including my very good friend Joanne Halpern and the rabbi and members of just down the street, B'nai David Judea, the synagogue, as well as the Hadassah of the Los Angeles area, and others who helped to bring us together tonight to talk about something of crucial importance to all of us as Jews, irrespective of whether we count ourselves as traditional, Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, Chabad, atheist. It almost doesn't matter. Reinvigorating an understanding of Israel's place in each and every one of us, our lives, of the importance of Zionism and understanding Zionism, the importance of Israel and understanding its centrality to our very existence, is what brings us here today, together. And of course, all of you who are viewing this at home on the internet as well. We have a vested interest in understanding the underpinnings of what Zionism means and what Israel means to us as Jews, in order to inform and to strengthen our ability to disseminate that centrality both within our community and well beyond it. My intention tonight is to discuss some of the fundamental issues that for some reason, and I think there are some discernible reasons, we ourselves as a community have lost. Some of the fundamental, foundational principles of our very Jewish peoplehood have been lost in the volume of issues and arguments and activism and advocacy work that we do, all of which is important, and yet somehow we seem to be missing the forest for the trees. That's what we want to talk about tonight, and I don't intend to lecture at you so much as to hopefully provoke a discussion, both here tonight and then going outwards and onwards from here, about these very important, fundamental principled issues with regard to who we are, our place, well, in the universe in general, but within our community, in this country, in Israel, in world forums, in the media, and elsewhere, and how we can understand the simple arguments, the simple statements, the simple terminology that we can use in order to help the world, and not least policymakers in that world, to both understand more and to reach logical, rational conclusions regarding the policies that they might wish to pursue with regard to the Middle East. So let's get started. And I commit to you to speak for not longer than 45 minutes, to leave a good 45 minutes of questions and answers and discussions to follow on from my opening remarks. 2 years ago, in fact, it's exactly 2 years ago now, I set out on a hike along what's known as the Israel Trail. Many of you may be familiar with Shvil Yisrael, the Israel Trail, which is, for lack of a better description, Israel's answer to the Appalachian Trail, or because we're in Los Angeles, I'll compare it to the Pacific Crest Trail. In fact, I'm writing a book about my hike along the Israel Trail, which I don't want to compare to the book Wild, which of course many of you are familiar with from the book or from the film. But unfortunately, there's some similarities. I was divorced 2.5 years ago, and I set out on the hike on the Israel Trail just 6 weeks after my divorce, and it was, of course, a very personal, transformative experience, but I'd been planning it for years. It was, to a certain extent, coincidental that I set out on it when I did, and yet that transformative experience of hiking the length and breadth of Israel went a lot deeper than the personal, cathartic, physical expression of moving on with my life, as it were, stepping forward after my own facing, or as part of my facing my personal challenges. I reconnected with the land of Israel, but more importantly, with our history, with my identity as a member of a tribe that's been in existence for 3,500 years, walking through the same forests and deserts and hills and valleys that my ancestors, including our prophets, walked, tread, meditated in, and lived in. And that connection that I felt while hiking over the course of over 800 kilometers, over the course of 8 weeks, about 12 to 15 miles a day with a 50-pound pack on my back, alone for the most part. That connection is something that I want to bring into this discussion of who we are and how we relate to Israel as a modern nation state, and the land of Israel as our patrimony, as it were, as our ancestral homeland, for all of us to understand the depth of our connection to the land, to our people, and to our modern state, which should inform all of our activism, all of our advocacy, all of our letter-writing campaigns, all of our lobbying efforts, even our conversations with our neighbors, Christian or Jewish, with whom we try to communicate, and we try to impress upon them what's really important about what's going on over there in Israel and throughout the Middle East. This connection, I just want to begin with the context within which we're having this discussion, is not something new. We all just celebrated Purim 3 days ago. And we read in the Megillah very, very explicitly, Yesh no am echad mifuzar o mifurad. There is, it says in the Haggadah, a certain people, says Haman to King Ahasuerus. There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all your provinces. What does that mean, a people? Was he talking about Jews as a religious community? No, he wasn't. Haman was identifying back then a people, a nation, a tribe, an ethnic identity, if you will, which existed at that time in a fashion which today is not nearly as well understood. We're now in the period leading up to Pesach, to Passover, which is the celebration not only of our deliverance from slavery in Egypt and the independence and liberty that we achieved by leaving and escaping the bondage under Pharaoh, but Pesach, Passover, is also a celebration not just of our freedom as a community that escaped slavery, and it's not just a celebration which we celebrate, of course, then in Shavuot, the culmination of the deliverance, which is the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, but it's integral to our understanding of who we are, that we were forged as a nation, as a national identity based on our family that became a clan, that became a tribe, that became a nation. Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, when we emerged from Egypt into the desert, before we became a religious faith community after the giving of the Torah at Sinai. Before that, we were one people. An identity forged in the slavery in Egypt, but which was consummated, which came together in the deliverance from Egypt. And today, in this period between Purim and Pesach, is a perfect time to talk about reawakening our identity within the context of modern Zionism. I think what I want to begin with and to end with, to a certain extent, is a recognition that everything we're discussing tonight is not political. And to a great extent, it's not religious either. Which is why it's so wonderful that we come together from unique backgrounds without any reference to either the presidential elections and primaries that are taking place literally today as we speak, without any reference to those sitting here or watching at home, whether we're Democrats or Republicans, or in the Israeli context, whether we're more on the left or the right, liberal, conservative. There are things that we together can acknowledge. And this is a message that when I was working with Natan Sharansky for over a decade, he drove home night and day when he used to say that the KGB, when they arrested him, when they interrogated him, they didn't ask him, are you a Reformed Jew or a conservative Jew or an Orthodox Jew? They yelled at him and beat him because, as he said, that they said to him, you are a Jew. And the fascinating thing about that, which is reflected in an article I just read by Mark Oppenheimer in Tablet magazine that came out yesterday, about the distinction between how we describe ourselves. Do we describe ourselves with an adjective, I am Jewish? Or taking a stronger position, adopting and embracing the noun of our identity, I am a Jew? And of course the KGB, reflecting the Amalekite Haman, describing and calling and supposedly denigrating Mr. Sharansky as a Jew, as an epithet, was a reflection of their understanding of our identity. Not as somebody who shares a certain faith or a belief system, which is only a religious construct, but rather that our identity is as a people, as Haman said. That issue today should drive all of our advocacy and understanding. It should inform our own emotional connection to the issues. Whether we're arguing for an immediate withdrawal by Israel from the territories that are in dispute, the territories of Judea and Samaria, those described sometimes erroneously as the West Bank. Not erroneously, that's a good geographic description. It is the West Bank of the Jordan River. But described, as I wrote in an article just a few weeks ago, accurately by cartographers and historians as Judea and Samaria, without any political overtone, even those wishing to see Israel relinquish its claim on those territories. People like Shlomo Avineri, the doyen of Israeli political science, or Moshe Raz, one of the founders of Peace Now, one of the founders of Meretz, the far-left political party in Israel. Moshe Raz is one of those who acknowledges and insists that others acknowledge that we Jews and Israelis have a legitimate claim to those areas known as Judea and Samaria, even as he advocates a withdrawal by those same Israelis in favor of a Palestinian claim. You understand that what I'm saying is I'm setting up an understanding that this is not a political issue. Because you can advocate, as I said, an immediate withdrawal from those territories of Judea and Samaria, or you can be an ardent proponent of Israeli annexation of this heartland of the Jewish people, Judea and Samaria, and still agree on the definition that we're discussing tonight of our identity as Jews, irrespective of our political or religious affiliation. It was Abba Ibn who said, and I quote, "Zionism is nothing more, but also nothing less than the Jewish people's sense of origin and destination in the land linked eternally with its name. The name Israel, with the land of Israel, for the people of Israel, today living in the modern nation state of Israel." Do you know, we have a linguistic confusion in modern times. We call ourselves Jews. We practice a set of behaviors, observances, and beliefs we call Judaism. And we have this modern nation state called Israel. What's the connection? The founding fathers of Israel considered, you may not know this tidbit of history, but the two finalists in the discussion of what to call this new nascent state for the Jewish people, the two finalists for the name of this state were Israel and Judea. To me, as a student of linguistics, is that it was the Hebrew-speaking founding fathers of the modern nation state who chose the name Israel for a number of reasons, but linguistically it's clear to understand for all those who speak Hebrew. Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, Be'eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, Lefi Torah or Masoret Yisrael, according to the traditions and religiosity of Israel, founded a modern nation state, Yisrael. That makes sense. Just think today, all of the discussions about whether the Jews are colonialists, imperialists, European implants, not native to the land. If we had a state called Judea, in the English-speaking world, there would be no disconnect, because clearly Jews have returned to their ancestral homeland of Judea. just like Greeks founded a new modern nation state called Greece, which in fact had no real historical connection to ancient Greece, but linguistically the nomenclature makes it clear that modern Greece is the inheritor of a civilizational, cultural, social and intellectual milieu that dates back to ancient Greece. Let's face it, this issue of Israel as the state for the Jewish people is at base what is missing from a lot of our public dialogue. Do you know it was ubiquitously understood 100 years ago? If you read the contemporaneous discussions at the turn of the last century, the beginning of the Zionist movement, in Europe, those who supported and those who opposed the idea of encouraging the creation of a national home for the Jewish people, a resurrection of the ancient Israelite kingdoms, an encouragement of Jews migrating in larger numbers to the Levant, to the Middle East. Those discussions never raised the question, are the Jews a people? In fact, even today, but certainly back then, one of the roots of traditional anti-Semitism was very much along the lines of Haman's statement. There's this people over there, they're different. And the animosity towards the Jews was partially religious, but very definitely ethnic, racial, tribal, that these people, they're just different. So the discussion was all around the question of whether in this movement towards greater self-determination in the beginning of the 20th century, those Jews have a right, whether we should encourage their interest in re-establishing an independent entity there. There was never a discussion of, are Jews a people or not? Fast forward 100 years to today, and you find again and again, even in the pro-Israel community, Christian, Jewish, or otherwise, among political leaders throughout Europe and America, including those who would be the first to agree that Israel has a right to exist, that Israel has a right to defend itself, including the present leadership of the United States, there are many who view Judaism through a prism of a Christian understanding of a faith community, a system of beliefs. There's Buddhism, there's Islam, there's Christianity, and there's Judaism. These are belief systems. You can believe, you don't believe, you practice, you don't practice. But this idea that Judaism is just another belief system is one of the founding challenges that we face in the Jewish community, as well as in the policymaking community, on our college campuses, in the academic community, obviously among church leaders, even among trade union leaders and others in our cultural milieu, cultural leaders and icons who don't understand. And that's what we need to reinforce. That Judaism is a civilization. That we Jews are first and foremost a family, a tribe, a clan, a nation, a national identity, even before we identify ourselves as a religion. I'll prove it to you with a very, very simple exercise. In walks a man into our group today. And in the building, you know what, I'm going to change the exercise slightly. Imagine that today is Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, on which we fast and atone for our sins. And we're sitting today together here at the Jewish Activity Center of LA, and we're in the middle of a prayer service on Yom Kippur. And in walks a man with a black hat, tzitzit on, a black coat, long beard. Raise your hands if any of you would question whether that's a Jew. Nobody raises their hands. I'm putting aside the issue of whether or not outward appearances are important. Now, a minute later, in walks somebody who you happen to know, because he's your neighbor and friend and you grew up with him and his mother and his grandmother. You happen to know this man was born of a Jewish mother. Mother was born of a Jewish mother. He walks in on Yom Kippur eating eating a cheeseburger, and sits down, eats his cheeseburger. Raise your hands if you would say this person is not a Jew. And we all know that most of us, there was one tentative hand raised, but we'll have that discussion afterwards. According to all of our understandings of what it means to be a Jew, it matters not your religious observance. And that's the one proof point to make about our understanding, even when we don't think about it, of the peoplehood of our Jewish identity. Do you know there's an esoteric argument going on until today, started in the 1950s, among cultural anthropologists and sociologists, about what are the main civilizations of the world. China, Japanese civilization, Western civilization. I don't even remember the list, but there are 5 of them. And the esoteric academic argument surrounds the question of those Jews. Should they be defined as a separate civilization? After all, they have their own language, their own culture, their own literature, their own homeland, and other aspects of civilizational identity. But on the other hand, Western civilization was born from, owes a debt to, a debt that is most often acknowledged by Western philosophers. Western civilization came out of Jewish civilization, and therefore there are those who say that Jews are part of Western civilization, and there are others who say they should be defined as their own separate civilization. That esoteric academic argument is less relevant how it's resolved than the fact that the argument takes place within the context of the understanding of our identity, of who we are and how we should be defined as Jews. It's very interesting. There is not just an understanding of who we are and how we relate to each other in a gut level, but there's a whole literature defining what we mean when we talk about Jewish peoplehood. And because I said I don't want to lecture at you, I'm not going to go into chapter and verse of the Jewish and non-Jewish academics who argue how do we define peoplehood. But I do want to at least share with you 3 underlying elements that are the foundation of our understanding of what it means to be a part of the Jewish people. One aspect is the feeling aspect. It's a multi-dimensional understanding or even experience of simply belonging to something larger than ourselves. The second, interestingly enough, is a rejection of any dominant ideology, meaning being cognizant of what Jewish peoplehood is means that you can be a Reform liberal Jew who believes that Tikkun Olam and the universalistic social justice principles of the prophets are the driving principle and most important ideological foundation of Judaism. You can be a strictly Orthodox Jew who believes that halakhically following every single one of the commandments is your foundational understanding of what it means to be a Jew. You can be a secular Israeli kibbutznik working the land who believes that your understanding of what it means to be a Jew is expressed by your life. And you can be an entirely atheist Jew having no religious affiliation whatsoever, living in France, discussing philosophy and believing that that aspect, the intellectual fervor of Jewish thought and argument, is the foundational aspect of being a Jew. And all of those allow you to have a strong connection as a member of the Jewish people, precisely because Jewish peoplehood declares that there is no one foundational ideological basis. Being a member of the people is that foundation. The third issue is kind of an esoteric way of saying that with those first two, with the multidimensional experience of Jewish belonging, combined with the rejection of any specific individual, unique, dominant ideological basis, we come up with a focus on the connection between individual Jews as the basis of our feeling of Jewish peoplehood, not necessarily a focus on Jewish identity. Isn't that fascinating? It's such it's a dilemma. After living in Israel for 30 years, sometimes you lose your English vocabulary. There's a word I'm looking for, when two things clash that contradict each other. It's a conflicting... Thank you. Paradox is the word I was looking for. It's such a paradox to say that belonging to the Jewish people is not ideological. It's a feeling of belonging. But that's what we're talking about. That is the combination which academics at least have identified as our understanding of what it means to be a member of the Jewish people. It's not political. It's not religious. It doesn't rely on your behavior, which is why we come back to my example of the person who walks in, male or female, to a Yom Kippur service eating a cheeseburger, who will be acknowledged universally as a member of the Jewish people, even while he or she rejects some of the basic religious standards of that people. Where does that leave us? It leaves us facing one primary myth which permeates the public discourse about Israel and about Jews, which I believe is what we have to bring into every discussion of Israel and of Jews, irrespective of the context. You can be the most prolific letter writer to the LA Times about their significant and frequent bias against Israel in their headlines and the way they report and what they choose to report. You can be the most vociferous advocate for Israel on a college campus. You can be the most active lobbyist for Israel, whether it's with AIPAC or the AJC or other groups in Washington. And throughout all of those activities, one of the things that we have neglected to our detriment is this issue of an understanding of just what Israel's about within the context of our Jewish identity and Jewish peoplehood. What do I mean? Let me actually relate what I believe are the three fundamental myths in public discourse today, on our college campuses, in the media, as well as in the political echelon, the third of which will bring us directly back to our discussion of reasserting the legitimacy of Israel and of Zionism, and back to this theme of today's discussion of reawakening our Zionism. There are three myths that today are repeated ad nauseum, are accepted at almost every level of public discussion about Israel. And when I use the term myths, I'm explicitly referring to misconceptions, misunderstandings. If you will, I'll use stronger language, lies about Israel and about the situation in the Middle East. I'll very briefly review the first two, and we'll get to the third, which I've already mentioned, but I'll elaborate on. Myth number one is that Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian leadership in general are moderate, and that they want peace. That's not meant as a laugh line, and yet the laughter that ensues indicates that at least you sitting here today, taking part of this discussion, don't need a lot of convincing when it comes to that myth. It's clear that by their statements, through their actions, their refusal to compromise, their refusal to negotiate, the leadership of the Palestinian Authority, including their incitement against Jews and Christians, for the record, and against Israel and America and the West, can in no uncertain terms be called moderate. They might, certain leaders among them, be called pragmatic. If you want to distinguish between Hamas, the more extremist, radical, jihadist element in Palestinian society, and Fatah, led by Mahmoud Abbas, the governing faction in the PLO, and the heads of the Palestinian Authority, you want to distinguish between the radicals and the others, you might say that Mahmoud Abbas has taken a more pragmatic stance. Moderate, if the word has any meaning in our English lexicon, implying tolerance, willingness to compromise, an interest in coexistence. Obviously, under any normal definition of the word, the Palestinian and most unfortunately most of the rest of the Arab and Muslim world today cannot be called moderate, however pragmatic some of them may be. And that's a problem both in the media, which we deal with in our activities at Media Central, the project of honest reporting that I'm still involved in, that I ran for 10 years until last year, and also in all of our activities with political leaders, commentators, academics in particular. That myth it's imperative that we address that myth, not because we want to diss the Palestinians, not because we want to make them look bad, but because an accurate reflection of just who it is that we're dealing with is imperative for anybody who wants to formulate reasonable public policy with regard to any potential moves towards peace between Israel and the Palestinians. The second myth, which you hear repeated ad nauseum, is that it's those settlements, it's the occupation, and those settlements which are the primary cause for a lack of movement towards peace in the Middle East. And you hear that constantly. It's the settlements that's preventing movement towards peace. I don't think I need to go into chapter and verse of the historical record where Israel dismantled those Jewish communities in Gaza and northern Samaria, which did not bring about peace, but rather even more rocket fire and hostility from Gaza. I don't need to give the example of Lebanon or our withdrawal from Lebanon and the idea that an Israeli withdrawal does not actually lead to peace. I want to suggest to you an intellectual argument which also disproves this myth that somehow those Jewish communities scattered throughout Judea and Samaria are somehow the primary obstacle to peace in the Middle East. And that intellectual argument is very simple to understand. Most of you, because you're here tonight giving up your Sunday evening or watching online because you care about Israel. So I'm sure that you know that 20% of Israel's citizens are Arab, mostly Muslim Israelis. 20%, 1.3 or 1.4 million people in Israel are Arab, mostly Muslim citizens of Israel. The concept, and this is an intellectual argument, imagine with me, if you will, for a second, that the Arabs really do want peace. That they're interested in living alongside the Jews in our ancestral homeland, like France and Germany after 800 years of warfare decided they'd had enough of that and it was time to live in peace. If you imagine for a moment that that was really possible, then I'm sure you'll agree with me the compelling nature of this intellectual argument that having a few thousand Jews living as part of this supposed state of Palestine, wherever it would be established, in whatever borders it would be established, having a very small minority of Jews, not 20%, 2% of their country, maybe 0.2%, as Jewish citizens of Palestine or Jewish citizens of Israel who happen to live in Palestine, like Americans may live in Canada or Canadians may live in Israel, theoretically puts paid to this claim that somehow Jews living in Beit El or Ofra or Efrat or elsewhere somehow is an impediment to peace. If real peace were on offer, I can't imagine an Arab leader having any more trouble if they were a leader prone to real tolerance, real moderation, interested in the welfare of their own people rather than in destroying our people, that the idea of a few Jews living as a minority in their state would actually be anything of a challenge. And it's that intellectual argument that enables us to put paid to that second myth. No, it's not those nefarious Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, the settlements, which are the primary obstacle to peace in the Middle East. What is the primary obstacle? Here's where we get to the third myth that brings us back to the importance of reasserting the legitimacy of Israel. Myth number 3, which is constantly repeated by the highest echelons of our government, European governments, our media and academics, is that this is somehow an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is some sort of territorial conflict, that if only we could just decide where to draw the borders, that would bring peace, not just between Israel and the Arabs, but throughout the Middle East. Even looking at it as a nationalistic conflict is too narrow. Were that it were so, that the Palestinians simply wanted their own country alongside the nation state of the Jewish people in whatever borders, whether it was in the territories that are disputed, otherwise known as the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, or if it was in Jordan, or if it was somewhere else. Were that it were so, that it was just a national conflict, because that would be resolvable. In 15 minutes, we could sit down and figure out where the border should go, irrespective of historical injustices, perceived or real. No, that third myth belies the reality that what today is the primary obstacle to peace in the Middle East is as it was 100 years ago. The violent, hostile rejection by the leaders of those who call themselves Palestinians, most of the leaders of the Arab world, most of the leaders of the Muslim world, unfortunately, the violent, constant, hostile rejection of any legitimacy given to the idea of the Jews as a people, the Jewish connection to the land of Israel, and therefore any legitimacy given to the founding of the nation state of the Jewish people, Israel. That third myth is the most nefarious, because if we acknowledge the fact that this is an ideological struggle, this is a religious, civilizational conflict between the Islamic and Arab and Palestinian leadership. And note, I'm very careful, I'm talking about the leadership. It's the leadership that promulgates these attitudes. This ideological hatred and rejection of Israel and Jews, let alone the West and America, Christians and others, is at base what is responsible for the perpetuation of this conflict. And that brings us back to our role in reasserting that very legitimacy. Do you know, it's funny. Had we been having this discussion 2 years ago, some of you on the left of the Israeli or American political spectrum might want to argue with me, might want to return our conversation to focus on the national and territorial nature of the conflict, might want to focus on this or that particular policy carried out by Israel that you might argue with. But today, there are so many on the left in Israeli politics, and so too here in America, that are acknowledging this basis, that it makes the discussion so much more pleasant and the argument so much more compelling for all of us to adopt or re-adopt this fundamental element in all of our discussions. I'm referring to people like Isaac Herzog, the leader of the Labour Party, the opposition in Israel, who is on record just a few weeks ago talking about this is an ideological civilizational struggle, and we have to recognize that today, we have no partner in Israel across the table with whom we can negotiate. This includes Moshe Raz, who I was mentioning earlier, Shlomo Avineri I mentioned, Daniel Gordis. The best example to give is Lucy Aharish. Lucy Aharish, you may be familiar, some of you, with ITV News, the new online channel in English as well as in Russian, Arabic, Spanish, and other languages, bringing news out of Israel. Lucy started there, and now she's an anchor, the first Arab-Israeli anchor of an Israeli television news program on Channel 2. Arab, Muslim, Israeli, who on a talk show just a few months ago, it was a talk show where she was the interviewee, ironically enough. She wasn't presenting the news, she was sitting on the other side of the table being asked about her attitudes and her identity and her different conflicts with that identity, and she turned to the camera and spoke to the Arab and Muslim leadership, both of the radical elements in Israeli society the Palestinian society across the 49 armistice lines and the rest of the Arab world, and literally said to them, and I quote, "What are you doing? What are you doing to us? You're ruining our lives with your focus on such hatred, with your continuing this conflict." Lucy Aharish, as an Arab Muslim Israeli, among many others that can be described, some of whom you may be familiar with, maybe you've even heard them give powerful and moving talks. Ismail Khaldi, who was at the Consulate in San Francisco until a few years ago. Khalid Abu Tuami, very good friend of mine, who's the Palestinian and Arab Affairs reporter for the Jerusalem Post and also a fellow at the Gatestone Institute. Bassem Eid, who's a Palestinian, not even an Israeli citizen, but other Arab and Muslim, Muhammad Dajani, another Palestinian, the head of the Wasatiyah movement, a moderate movement within Islamic and Palestinian society. These are Arabs who speak cogently and compellingly about their understanding of their own identity, but more importantly, of Jewish peoplehood. This recognition that it is a myth that what we're up against is a Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and that we're up against actually an ideological, civilizational struggle, brings us back to an understanding of what we have to do today. We, those of us sitting here, those of us with us online, all of us, heads of major Jewish organizations and non-Jewish organizations that are counted as Christian, those of us who are working in the academic world, with media, in the political realm, as well as day-to-day conversations with our neighbors, we all should have as a basic point of discussion, before we get into the policy issues of should Israel or should they not carry out a particular defensive military operation, should women be allowed to carry a Sefer Torah, the scrolls of the Torah, at the Western Wall, should Israel annex the territories or withdrawal from them, should we build that security barrier or tear it down. Reasonable people can debate all of these issues. But the foundational beginnings and endings of those arguments should be our assertion. And this, I would be happy if it's the only takeaway from this entire discussion that you remember. Reasserting the legitimacy of Israel, reawakening our Zionism, can be done in very simple steps, with very simple language. Incorporate three basic ideas into every conversation, every letter we write, every interaction that we have when we are trying to be an advocate for Israel. And those three things are this. Number one, that Jews are a people. That as a people, our national and ethnic identity, our civilization, I mentioned, like the Greeks, if you will, is what makes us unique in the annals of human history. The combination of a people and religious identity and practice together is unique. And because it's unique, we need to reassert a unique vocabulary to represent that, and not allow others to define our identity for us. Those who argue that Israel as a democracy, because of the great tenet, certainly here in America, of the separation of church and state, that Israel as a democracy should be a state for all its people, and not give preference to Jews in immigration to Israel, for instance, or in public services, don't understand that that preference for Jews to immigrate to Israel is because we are a people, a national and ethnic identity. Raise your hand if you're familiar with the fact that today, on the law books in Poland, Ireland, Italy, Spain, and Greece, 5 democratic nations in the heart of Europe, those Americans who can trace their ancestry to immigrants from Ireland, Italy, Poland, Spain, and Greece to America 150 years ago or 100 years ago, can get automatic citizenship in those countries. Raise your hands if you knew that. Very few. I'm glad at least some do. Thank you, Cecile. So few people know that. And yet, when I asked a college audience, the University of Oregon in Portland, a while back, whether or not this made any of them uncomfortable, whether they felt that Americans of Polish ancestry who took on a second citizenship and either moved to Poland or didn't even move there but became Polish citizens, whether that made them feel any betrayal or they felt it was disloyal, nobody felt that. But when I asked this room full of 150 of America's leading students, the University of Oregon is one of America's leading intellectual institutions, whether they were uncomfortable with Israel's law of return, a half of the room raised their hands. Why? Because Judaism is seen as a religion, and of course no democracy should give one religion preference over another. That's the first thing that we have to reinvigorate and reintroduce to our public discourse. Jews are a people. We're not just a member of a religious faith community. Second, as I quoted Abba Ibn, that Zionism is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. We never used that term. In the progressive world for the last 40 years, national liberation movements have been one of the prime principles underlying both our international relations and our advocacy work, which is one of the reasons why the PLO became the darling of the left in America. Because national liberation movements from Che Guevara through Yasser Arafat were seen as something that was a very, very important principle, the principle of self-determination. We Jews never talk about Zionism as our national liberation movement. Partially because we take it for granted, partially because we've lost that vocabulary, partially because we haven't recognized how debilitating it is to argue over our right to defend ourselves, which any legitimate state has, without basing our very legitimacy on the argument that appeals to most Americans, especially our liberal brothers and sisters, who care about the issues of national liberation movements. Third, and most importantly, I learned from a non-Jewish First Nations leader from Canada the importance of another phrase that I never used until I heard him use it 2 years ago. And now I insist that this is the most compelling element of the paradigm shift, the change of mindset that I'm calling for from all pro-Israel leaders, Jewish and otherwise, and that is this. He said, and I quote, that there is no other example in history of a successful movement. If you think for a second, what are First Nations? The First Nations are the Canadian Native Americans, as it were, American Indians who now call themselves, and we call them Native Americans, the same part of that movement, like the Aborigines in Australia and what have you, looking to reassert their national identity and their claim to their ancestral homeland. It was Ryan Bellerose who taught me that the Jewish return to our ancestral homeland is the first and only example in the history of mankind where an indigenous people has returned to its ancestral homeland and reestablished its sovereignty there. Something that Ryan and other Native Americans and First Nations and Aborigines look to as an inspiring example of exactly what we're talking about here. And yet we have lost that vocabulary. The Palestinians, as they are now known, have hijacked that particular word, indigenous, with their pretense of being descended, which has been proven factually to be a myth, from ancient Canaanites or others. The Jews are the indigenous people in this region. And our return to our ancestral homeland is a miracle. It's a miracle that I live every day. It's a miracle that I celebrated while walking the Israel National Trail. I'm now writing a book about my experiences, which relates a lot to my wonder, not only at the beauty of the land, and not only at the historical connection with our prophets wandering through the Judean desert, for instance, or stumbling across, as I did, the tomb of Eliyahu Hanavi in the north, but my connection also to the people of Israel, the varied assortment, Sephardim and Ashkenazim and Iraqis and Libyans and Brits and Australians and others, people who have been in the country for 8 generations and people who had arrived in the country 8 days before I met them. That concept of an indigenous people returning to our ancestral homeland is a very big part of the book that I'm writing. And what I'm trying to suggest here today with you is that that issue, not just the academic term national liberation movement of the Jewish people, not just the gut level understanding that no, we're more than a religious belief system and practices, we are a people, a clan, a tribe, a nation, but this vocabulary which is so powerful, that we are the indigenous people and we have returned to our ancestral homeland, must be part of every interaction that we have with regard to Israel and the current predicament that we find ourselves in vis-a-vis the Arabs and the Palestinian community in particular. Don't mistake for a moment that I'm suggesting anything political here. As the indigenous people returning to our ancestral homeland, reasonable people can debate all sorts of possibilities and alternatives of how we can resolve our conflict with the Arabs. Withdrawing from territory, declaring sovereignty over territory, having joint sovereignty over parts of those territories, encouraging the creation of a Palestinian state somewhere, perhaps across the Jordan River, in a country now known as Jordan, which actually has control of 70% of the original Palestine in the Palestine Mandate given to Great Britain by the League of Nations, or perhaps in Judea and Samaria, that heartland of the Jewish people, if real peace were to come. Still today, 70% of Israelis are willing to at least consider, perhaps not championing that idea, perhaps not pushing it forward aggressively, but willing to consider the idea of withdrawing from those territories in favor of an Arab claim in the interest of real peace. But the bottom line is still very powerful. We are the indigenous people. We have returned to our ancestral homeland, and it's time now, I will just conclude by saying, it's time for all of us to stand up and be counted when we are attacked in the media, on our college campuses, in the political echelon, in Europe as well as in America, from both sides of the aisles, by the way. Before we go into the very important advocacy work and activism and specific issues that we're dealing with, boycott, divestment, and sanctions activities on college campuses, legislation, one issue or another, Jerusalem, the declaration of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and the move of the United States Embassy to Jerusalem, promised in every election season and never acted upon. The issue of Israel's defensive military operations. Are they moral? Are they legal? What's the legal status of those territories? What's the legal status of our blockade of Gaza? Before we get into the nitty-gritty of those discussions, what I am suggesting, what I'm demanding, is that we begin with a reference to the Jewish people's return to our ancestral homeland as the indigenous people there. And then we can discuss all of the different parameters and debates on policy issues. The bottom line is this. If you can imagine with me for a second, and this is what I did when I was hiking the Shvil, when I was hiking the Israel Trail, and that's why I started this discussion with a reference to the trail, not just because I'm writing a book about it, but because it informs my understanding of these issues. When I was hiking the trail, and having worked for over a decade, as Cecile said, with Natan Sharansky, his discussion and understanding of his own membership in the Jewish people, and my walking the length and breadth of the Jewish homeland, brought me to a point where I I would sit on a mountaintop. I actually had a picture that I was going to show you on the screen, but we didn't get it up in time before we started. I was sitting on a mountaintop in the desert, in the Negev, meditating, surrounded by nothing but brown hills of every shade of brown possible. And I was imagining a situation of real peace. Any of you who have ever visited Israel, any of you who have ever looked at a map of Israel that reflects the population density and the vast area, it's phenomenal to understand. As somebody who grew up in the United States of America, who understands the idea of driving all the way across America and finding ways to do so without coming into contact with almost anybody the entire time, you don't think of Israel or the land of Israel as a massive land mass. It's teeny. But in a situation of real peace, if you imagine with me for a second that our neighbors truly, sincerely want to live in peace with us. That old adage, which I think is attributed to Golda Meir, but it maybe came up before her, that if the Arabs were to lay down their arms, there would be peace tomorrow. And if the Jews were to lay down our arms, there would be no Jews tomorrow. If we could imagine for a second that wasn't true, that we came to a point, whether Mashiach is here or just on his way or her way, if we came to a point where the Arabs truly wanted peace, there is so much room in the Negev and in the Galil, in the hills of the Shomron and the hills around Hebron. There's so much space, there's so much peace, there's so much quiet, there's so much beauty, that if we could just imagine for a minute that our neighbors wanted to achieve that peace, if they accepted that we as the indigenous people returning to our ancestral homeland are coming there with a desire to fulfill our prophet's vision of peace in the land and throughout the planet, what an amazing miracle that would be. That's the message we have to drive home. Thank you. I promised to give time for discussion. So, Aryeh, I'm going to let you drive the time and the clock. You can tell me when we're finished. I don't want anybody to feel that they're a captive audience, but I'm very happy to take a few questions. You can argue with me or ask me to elaborate if you'd like. We've had a few people with their hands up for quite a while. Yes.
Okay. My question is.
I'll repeat the question. Go ahead.
Okay. My question is my answer is. Okay. First of all, I'm in touch with some people over there, and I mean I don't want to argue or anything, but they're telling me 50% of the people now, and why should we? Okay, so that's the question I have to answer. 60% of the people in the West Bank want to annex Samarian Judea. If you call it the West Bank, I call it Samarian Judea. And why should we be, this is my question, why should we have land for peace? Why don't we just have peace for peace?
The question, which is a very good question, is why are we even talking about land for peace? Why don't we talk about peace for peace? And I 100% agree with you. And in fact, my closing remarks I think addressed very much specifically that issue, that we wait, we hope, we pray for precisely that, for a true and sincere desire of peace on the part of our neighbors, which would enable us, I think, to reach and achieve real peace in the region. I agree. Yes, sir.
Israel has made a major mistake by allowing Yasser Arafat and his henchmen to come back and poison the population. And now they are reaping the benefits of what they did. And I don't see really much way out of it.
And again, I have to agree with you. What's your name?
Yesha.
Yesha just said there is a reality that we should face, which is that we, Israel, made a tremendous strategic error in inviting and encouraging and allowing Yasser Arafat and his henchmen from Tunis to come into, what I sometimes say, parachute into the territories And I'll take it one step further than I think you intended. Having worked with Mr. Sharansky for well over a decade, I fully believe in his argument that democracies make peace with other democracies. And our fundamental flaw, which he argued with, I believe 3 weeks after the handshake on the White House lawn, was his first article. I believe it was in the Los Angeles Times, funny enough, where he argued precisely that point, that we were encouraging the establishment of a non-democratic regime which by definition would not be interested in making peace with its neighbors, but rather would be interested in fomenting conflict with its neighbors to justify its domestic repression. I can only agree with you, and yet what's important is for us not only to recognize the end of the Israeli government, which I do as an Israeli, and of the American government and the Europeans, to hold the Palestinian leadership accountable for its own repression of its own people, for its repression of gays and women and political dissent and otherwise. And also, by the way, there was an article about this, I believe, in the Observer, the Daily Mail in London just last week, about making transparent the funneling of aid monies from the UN, from Britain, from the EU and others into the Palestinian Authority coffers, which then go to pay either the salaries of or stipends to the families of terrorists. Terrorists under the textbook definition of terrorists, not political activists, but people who have murdered innocent civilians for political gain. That is the kind of thing that you are quite right, that we have to address and ensure that it informs our policies today, without question. Yes?
I think there's a major issue. The only ally we have in the Middle East is Israel. Yeah. And are you aware that the State Department website does not list Israel as a country? Yeah. And that, I think, is the beginning of the end, and it's a major problem, and that needs to be started, because if you don't start where the root cause is, where and how do you pursue it?
The point was made suggesting that the State Department website does not list Israel as a country. I'm not going to argue with you, but I would imagine that you're referring to the fact that Judea and Samaria is not recognized as part of Israel. If you're telling me that the United States State Department's website, in a list of 196 member nations of the United Nations, or what have you, doesn't include Israel, I would be surprised, and of course you're right, that must be redressed. But
why isn't this a major issue that...
I agree, it should be a major issue, no less than it is within the...
Dealing with major problems, which is the beginning of our...
I agree. If that's true, it should be redressed, and it should be redressed immediately through your representatives. Congress people, Senator Feinstein, Senator Boxer here from California, are fervently pro-Israel, and you should address immediately correspondence to them demanding that this be changed. And while you're at it, because I haven't seen that, so I can't comment on the State Department website in particular, but there's no question there are other organs of the United Nations, the EU, and elsewhere that this issue has to be addressed. Yeah.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but...
Put me on the spot, Joanne. That's okay.
It's a presidential election year, and I'm not asking you who you would vote for, and I don't believe that we should only be voting... I know a lot of people who do vote thinking only of Israel. When I vote for the President of America, as well as Israel's interests. But who of the candidates do you think actually understands?
Do you know... I am so often asked questions about the American election which I refuse to answer. This question I can answer very, very confidently. The question was, even though Joanne, who's a friend and one of the co-sponsors of the evening, doesn't want to put me on the spot and ask me who my preferred candidate is, which of course I wouldn't answer. But Joanne, also, you made the point, which I'm repeating now for the record, which is important, that you said that you voted for president or other positions here in America based on what's good for America, that you don't vote based on what's good for Israel.
I don't vote solely on what's
Right. Well, for the record, as an aside, it's an argument I have with many of my fellow American Israelis who live in Israel, some of whom vote based on what they think is good for Israel, and I argue with them about that. I believe if you're voting in an American election as an American citizen, you must vote for the candidate or candidates that you feel are best for America. What's fascinating, of course, is the corollary to that is, having lived in Israel for 30 years, on the front lines, as it were, or quite literally, of our civilizational struggle between the Western world and the world of the Islamic jihadist, fascist radicals, being on the front lines of that struggle informs my priorities when it comes to voting as an American. I will say, as an aside, I haven't yet answered your question, I believe that America needs to lead that civilizational struggle. That America is the country that should be leading the West in standing up to not just the Islamic State radicals, and not just Iran, but Hamas, Hezbollah, Boko Haram, and all the list of others. And this is not a Republican or Democratic issue, because there are Democrats who feel as strongly as I do about that. But that is certainly my number one priority, and I'm happy to go on record here, even though this is going online, to share with you that I have arguments with almost the entirety of my American family, some of whom are Jewish, some of whom are not, all of whom are supporters, or the vast majority of whom are registered Democrats and ardent supporters today of either Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton in the last elections of President Obama. And my argument with them comes down to something very simple. There are issues which are important to them, good, progressive, liberal, Jewish issues which are important, and I'm not suggesting they're not important. The environment, abortion rights, and who's going to be appointed to the Supreme Court, and is Roe versus Wade going to be overturned? Economic issues, of course, health issues, educational issues, going back to the environment and global warming, and those are very important issues. But to me, what's number 5 or 6 on their list is number 1 on my list, and that is national security and the importance of America leading this global struggle against the Islamofascists. And so, when you asked, the question that you asked, Joanne, was, which of the candidates running for president today do I feel best understands Israel, the Middle East, and or this wider strategic issue? My answer is none of them. None of them. None of them really understand it. Some of them get the civilizational struggle a bit more. Some of them are stronger on security and some of them are stronger on domestic issues. But my fundamental argument today has been that we as a community who support Israel need to reassert the very legitimacy of Israel's founding across the board, Republican and Democrats. As far as I'm concerned, whoever is the candidate for the Republican Party and the Democratic Party or an independent should be sitting down with somebody, with an Elie Wiesel, just as one example, somebody with great moral authority and no real political affiliation and no political agenda to grind with regard to Israel, and to sit down and to talk face to face with Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton or Ted Cruz or whoever else is ending up being the Donald Trump. I don't even remember the name of the third. Sorry about cases. And to have a heart-to-heart discussion. It doesn't take more than a half an hour. Not about the Holocaust, not about Israel's defensive military operations, not about borders, not even about peace with the Palestinians, but all about the Jewish people as the indigenous people of this land returning to its ancestral homeland through the process called Zionism, which is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. That conversation needs to be had with everybody, every candidate across the board. Enough said on that. Sorry.
With all the things that are happening in Europe, with terrorism, Islamic terrorism that's happening, how do you explain the rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, which very much is the same, and this BDS movement in Europe and in the United States? How can we explain that? You would think that they would be thinking otherwise now.
George is asking, how do I explain the rise of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, the two being conflated, both in terms of the BDS movement and other activities in Europe, but also in America. And I think there's a very simple way of understanding this. And I have my first degrees in psychology, but I'm not a social psychologist. I leave the academic discussions to others. But in my observation of the European and American social and cultural and intellectual milieu, I would say the following very simply. Number one, Europe in particular, since World War II, has been anti-militaristic. Europe at this point is only now recognizing that perhaps there is something in life worth fighting for and worth dying for. But for the last 40 years or so, as far as they were concerned, the highest priority is not to have a war. Nothing trumped that. Today, I think they're coming around a little bit. That's only one part of it. The second issue, of course, which we've seen with the development of the European Union, is because of the understanding that it was the national rivalry between France and Germany in particular, but England and others as well, over 800 years, that caused all this warfare, that caused all this bloodshed and suffering, that Europe became anti-nationalist. As proud as the French are of their Frenchness, and the British of their Britishness, the intellectual, ideological commitment to our national identity is something that the Europeans have basically shied away from over the last generation or two. What is the one democratic nation in the world outside of America who is fervently nationalist, even though I'm now suggesting we need to use better vocabulary to describe it, but still, Israel has been the most nationalist and willing to defend our national identity and our civilians with military force. So those two issues of being anti-militaristic and anti-nationalist come together in those Israelis. So by definition, without even thinking about it, from the gut, most Europeans find Israel off-putting at the least. Add to that the religious and historical and familial and cultural tropes of traditional anti-Semitism. Add to that the unfortunate juxtaposition of Arab and Muslim violent acts which are conflated supposedly with Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, even though the one has nothing to do with the other. But in the public's mind, in Europe in particular, that's the way it's seen. And you've got, obviously, a poisonous atmosphere which has led to greater and greater hostility. Thank God for some of the European leadership, intellectual and cultural and political leadership, that still has some idea of a moral compass. And I think we can see over the next few years, as we have the past few years, a little bit more of a warming towards Israel because of some of the things we've discussed today. But our job is to reinforce that, and no less here in America. Because what we see in Europe today, Natan Sharansky, who I took to some 65 college campuses across America a few years ago, he used to describe American college campuses within the wider milieu where most Americans support Israel. To today, the numbers are always around 66, 67% in any survey. When Americans are asked, who do you support, even though it's put incorrectly as an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which we discussed earlier, but when asked that question, 67% of Americans consistently say they support Israel, which is one of the reasons why their representatives in Congress continue to support Israel, not because of some nefarious Jewish lobby, as we all know. But Natan used to call, and still does, the American campuses little islands of Europe in America, when it comes to these intellectual arguments, and particularly with regard to Israel. So if we want to think to see what we're going to be up against in 20 years, when today's college students are our senators and our congresspeople and the advisors to, if not themselves, cabinet ministers, cabinet secretaries, we know what our effort has to be today to turn the tide of this public discussion, specifically with regard to those issues. Yes?
Speaking of college campuses, Over the last 7 years, Obama has brought 10,000 Muslim Vermont who flooded these colleges and were physically attacking Jewish students,
Right.
for those who support Israel. So when are you going to stop preaching to the choir and talk to Democrats, meaning Jewish Democrats, who voted for Obama 88% the first time, 64% the second time, and you're so brainwashed and so loyal to Democratic. Obama was clearly anti-Israel. Obama was clearly for Muslims. I could say it the first time I saw him. So why aren't you trying to get through to the Democrats? We all know, but you are not talking to
The question you're asking is a fair one. We should be talking with all Jews and all Americans, not, as you said, preaching to the converted of those who already believe in these things. So my answer is twofold. Number one, the invitation to this event and those watching online are not necessarily affiliated with one party or another, or one stream of Judaism or another, or one ideological camp, conservative, liberal, or another. This idea that Jews are returning to their ancestral home as the indigenous people there, that's something that of course we have to reinforce across the board, liberals and conservatives. What our challenge is, and this is why I'm returning the question right back to you, what our challenge is, how do we do this embracing and engaging those who are our political rivals on other issues like immigration or climate change or abortion or the economy or education, the environment or what have you? How do we insist and convince all Jews, however they relate to other issues and however they practice the faith side of our community, that this is our common language, that this is our common fight, and that is our challenge now today.
Insist that the Jewish go to the rich Jews insist that they stop funding the Democratic Party.
I'm going to leave that aside. Yes.
Is that me or her?
Go ahead, yes.
Yeah, so first of all, I thought you're very intelligent, you articulate a very good message, and I agree with you. But I
Thank
need
you.
to understand.
You can just stop there.
Okay. I need to understand how to explain that, and so I took your messages and I actually went to, you need to hear your competition. Unfortunately, our competition is not SJP or the Palestinians, it's Jews, and particularly J Street. So I went to a J Street meeting just to hear them and ask the 3 points that you mentioned. And I want to respond to how they did and hear how your response to them should be, because it's important that we can communicate with them and convince them. So number one, I said Abbas clearly does not want peace. They said they met with the boss many times. He's the most peaceful man in the world, and Israel, has no interest in peace, and all he wants to do. And they say, "Have you met with him?" Of course, I haven't. And
I got that.
Jeremy,
Okay.
Whatever.
Jeremy Ben-Ami.
Right. And then the second thing is, I said, just like you, these settlements are like less than 1% of the land, and if there's 1.2 million Arabs or 1.4 in Israel, and he said the point is this: no Palestinian state wants these. I forgot the word he said, but these crazy people in there, these are not normal Jews, these are radicals, and nobody wants these warmongers in their territory. So it's not that they don't want Jews in the state, they don't want warmongers in the state. And then the third thing, like you said, is the conflict is not Palestinian versus Israel, it's a broader concept. And again, he refuted that and said, no, this is all about, they have clear messages, obviously the right of return is one of their, and they have these things, and if we were able to meet them, then there would be peace. And so they, obviously they all cheered, and I didn't get my way, and I'm trying to understand how you can articulate a better message than I did.
I'm not going to repeat the whole question because my answer will include references to what you said.
You should debate him, by the way.
Well, funny you should say that. I was actually going to share with you that I was scheduled to debate Jeremy Ben-Ami about 2 years ago at the 92nd Street Y in New York, and for whatever reason he bowed out of the debate before it was finalized. I don't think it's because he was afraid to debate me. I know that he has debated Alan Dershowitz,
said he won't do that again.
who I thought was relatively effective.
One other thing
Yeah.
he said is his great-grandfather was part of the settlers in 1920 that formed Tel Aviv, and next to where Tel Aviv was being formed when it was ended were tons of Arabs, and the Arabs had been in that land for 3,000 years, and he shot down the other thing I said, which is that we are the only indigenous people, and he says that's not true. There was Canaanites, there was, a lot of people.
Okay, so
he disagrees with everything you're saying.
What's ironic is there are facts, and then there are ideas that Jeremy Ben-Ami and others propagate, perpetuate, which simply are not factually correct. One of the things that we did at Media Central for the last decade, and we continue to do, is to insist not that the media should be pro-Israel, only that the media should report accurately from the field. We know that the truth is on our side. And that's not political, because you can, as I've said now 2 or 3 times, advocate a withdrawal from the territories of Judea and Samaria while still recognizing that Israel has a legitimate historical and political and legal claim to those territories. But that's an accurate reflection of reality. Calling them occupied, which is a legal term under the Geneva Convention, which does not apply to these territories for various reasons I don't need to go into now. But our legal fraternity, in the West at least, in the Sorbonne, the French, those great friends of Israel, as well as in Harvard Law School and other law schools throughout the Western intellectual universe, who all teach the 1967 war as the paradigm of a justified war of self-defense under the UN Charter. And Israel's claim to those territories is unquestionable in the legal fraternity. Only the politicians use the term occupied, as in Joanne's occupying that chair, which is a colloquialism which is reasonable. But if, Joanne, you were to pick up that chair and walk out tonight, my guess is that Aryeh Rivkin might suggest that your occupation of that chair does not imply necessarily any real ownership. My point being that although we recognize the accuracy of the terminology, politicians and journalists and others unfortunately use shorthand to refer, for instance, to the territories as occupied, and that's one of our stumbling blocks. But when Jeremy Ben-Ami makes claims which are counterfactual, the answers are very simple. Starting from the last one, an indigenous people, as I learned from Ryan Belleros and others, has an academic and accepted definition. And one part of that definition is not just continual presence, but at least a historical and cultural and ethnic continuity that can be traced back. There are no Canaanites anymore. There are no Hittites or Jebusites or others. Yes, there were people in that land when the children of Israel crossed the Jordan River with Joshua and took it over. Yes, we took over the land. Forget about biblical promises. The point is that there are no people that are extant today that can claim more ancient connection to this land than we. Those Arabs who live in the land today, the vast majority of them, as proven by Joan Peters, were what are called in-migrants who came in the development of the economy of the region with the early Zionist movement. But I'm not here to give a lecture along those lines. But the bottom line is very simple. There are Arabs who trace their ancestry back a number of generations. There are those who trace their ancestry back more than 2 or 3, more than 5 or 8 also. And that's perfectly reasonable. There's always been a varied population in that land. There is no people that can trace their lineage back further than the Jews. The Arabs have what's called a right of presence. That does not mean that that right trumps the rights of the indigenous people. That was your last point. To address your first 3 points very quickly, when Jeremy Ben-Ami says, I've met with Mahmoud Abbas and I know he wants peace, I would like to know, does Jeremy Ben-Ami either have telepathy that he understands what's in Mahmoud Abbas's mind, or is he a psychologist with such great understanding of the human psyche that he knows for a fact what's in Mahmoud Abbas's mind? Because I judge the behavior of leaders based on two things. Not on their pronouncements in English to English-speaking audiences, saying the right words that they know they want to say. I judge them by the words they speak to their own people and by their actions. And as I briefly mentioned before, Mahmoud Abbas, when I described him as not one iota a moderate, has in his speeches and pronouncements in Arabic and in his actions fomented terror and incitement and de-legitimization and demonization of Israel and its leaders, has refused to negotiate and compromise. And we come to your reference of the right of return, etc., where the Arab community in general and the Palestinian leadership in particular have insisted on a number of parameters of coming to the table for negotiation, which by definition, their own definition, not some academic objective definition, but that too, but even by their own admittance, clearly is designed to eradicate the Jewish state, if not immediately by war, then over the course of a generation or two by demographics. The question of Jeremy Ben-Ami sitting with Mahmoud Abbas proves one thing and one thing only, that Mahmoud Abbas is a fantastic actor and liar. And I'm sorry to use that language. I don't want to use that language. I have many Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim friends, including colleagues, who truly do want peace and have shown by their behavior in public pronouncements that they accept the idea. Take a Walid Salem, the head of the Jerusalem Development and Community Foundation. He says very honestly, Jews were here, Jews are a people, Jews have a connection to this land, there was a temple. As a Palestinian Arab, I recognize that. I would like independence for my people as well, but I don't need to negate the Jewish connection to this land. You go back to King Abdallah. Actually, he was Prince Abdullah, I believe, back then in his meetings with Chaim Weizmann, who said, we welcome the Jews in their return to their ancient homeland. When we hear Mahmoud Abbas say that, then Jeremy Ben-Ami might be proved right. You said the second thing was regarding the Jewish communities and the settlements. I think I've said all that needs to be said about the factual nature of that not being an obstacle to peace. More than that, I didn't mention the clearly racist, exclusionary, discriminatory, and apartheid nature of a leader who says, we will have no Jews in our country. And the idea that democracies from Europe and America, or leaders in those democracies, are willing to accept that statement shows not only the moral depravity of he or they who make the statement, but the lack of any moral compass of those in the political or intellectual leadership of the West who are willing to accept that without argument. The third thing that we're talking about your point to them and to Jeremy Ben-Ami, who said, yes, it is a national conflict, yes, it is a territorial conflict. Again, I go back to what I said earlier in terms of the proof points, that the rhetoric that they use proves otherwise. Let me quote to you something I didn't quote in the beginning of my remarks. This is Mahmoud Abbas. This quote is perhaps the best proof for a Jeremy Ben-Ami or supporters of those who believe that the Palestinian leadership today, as it's seen today, are potential partners for peace. When we talk about the definition of a moderate, and when we understand that this is not a territorial issue, but rather an ideological and religious conflict, this is what Mahmoud Abbas said in Arabic to his own people just a few months ago. Go forth and defend Jerusalem with all your might. For every drop of blood spilled there is sacred. At whatever price, do not let the Zionist usurper place his filthy feet anywhere near Al-Aqsa. Let's take just a moment to parse this statement to understand exactly how depraved it is, and how it is impossible for anybody who speaks English and understands the use of the term moderate, or wants to refer to this individual as a potential partner for peace, or who says that no, this is a territorial conflict, not a religious one. When he says, with all your might defend Jerusalem, when he refers to every drop of blood spilled there is sacred, he's not talking about Jewish blood. He's calling for Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims to shed their own blood carrying out suicide attacks or attacks in which they know they will be killed in response. And that blood is sacred. The killing of innocents, men and women and children walking down the street, in a bus, in a cafe, being hacked to death, stabbed to death, shot, having rocks thrown through their windshield, and driven off the road and dying. That's defending Jerusalem with all their might, and that they should sacrifice themselves at whatever price. The suicide acts of terror is what he's referring to when he says at whatever price. And when we talk about the religious and ideological basis of this conflict, referring to the Zionist usurper, that by definition is a term that negates the legitimacy of Israel at its very founding, and does so in terms which are Islamic at base. The usurping of Dar al-Islam, the usurping of the Islamic Waqf, the Islamic trust, which is all of the land of Israel, places filthy feet. The reference to filthy feet is a religious reference. It's an ideological negation of the very humanity of the Jews. This is not a moderate. This is the answer to a Jeremy Ben-Ami or others who would suggest that any one of those three myths have any validity whatsoever. We have one last question, and I think then we should close the public format, because I don't want you to feel that you're a captive audience. I'll take one more question and answer it, and then I'm happy to stay around for a further discussion if you'd like.
Yes, sir. You're wrong, but you love eloquent reply. It's practically irrelevant. As long as George Soros is spending millions of dollars, he's spending Facebook and all the other social media, and spreading lies, Jeremy is going to be here. We can't do one thing, anything about it. We have to do something in order to approach the people. The UN and all the other people are against us.
Especially when a Jewish person running for office blames Israel and doesn't appear in front of AIPAC, whereas every other
I
member
very
of
much
the
appreciate the
It is-
question. I do.
It's very disgusting, and I think you, who have the opportunity, should approach a person of that ilk. He doesn't even deserve your time, unfortunately, but maybe we need it, because the one only Jewish person running doesn't appear at AIPAC. And
So I'm not going to address that latter issue, but I understand that you agree with the point made by this gentleman. What's your name? Oh, your husband. I'm glad that you agree with him. What's your name? Robert. I appreciate the point, Robert, because it enables me to close with two very important statements. Number one, you mentioned the vast monies, sums, that are going to these anti-Israel organizations. And you mentioned the United Nations, and it's blatant hostility towards Israel. We have an edict, we have a pithy aphorism coming out of the Mishnah. Lo alecha hamlamlacha ligmor, avata lo ben chorin litmameh mimenu. It is not incumbent upon you or us to finish the job, but neither are we free to desist from it. We are up against not just those you mentioned, and not just those you're discussing in the Jewish community. The vast, massive oil wealth of Qatar and Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and others who are funding 37 institutes of Middle East studies on our top campuses across the country, who are funding NGOs whose only raison d'etre is to criticize and castigate Israel. We're up against governments sitting on the United Nations, quote, and I'm sorry to put it into quotes, Human Rights Council, which should rename itself the United Nations Criticize Israel Council, because then at least they'd actually be doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so those funds are, of course, sums that we can't hope to achieve, but number one, we have to make the effort, and we have to use our funds. First of all, we should be giving more money. All of us, Jews and non-Jews who care about Israel, should be donating. Forgive me for making this plug, but Honest Reporting is a not-for-profit, a 501c3 here in America, and we are entirely funded by individual and foundation and sometimes federation grants. We have a very modest budget of about $1.5 million. Media Central has a very modest budget of about $400,000 as part of that, as a project of honest reporting. We should be giving 10 times as much to NGOs like Honest Reporting or Camera or the Israel Project, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, the ADL, Stand With Us, all of the different organizations,
Don't mention the
all of the organizations that fight on behalf of Israel, on behalf of the Jewish people. And that is one of the most important aspects, I think, in response to what you're saying. But there's something else too. And of course we should be giving to institutions like the Jewish Activity Centers of LA, just to round out from what Aryeh started with and their building campaign. But there's another aspect. It's not just money. Do you know, it's a very interesting thing. I had a fascinating discussion with the foreign editor of the New York Times not so long ago. Do you know that every subscriber of the New York Times who cancels their subscription gets at least 3 phone calls? The media is in a battle for every subscriber, for every viewer, for every listener. And they are listening when people call to say, hey, LA Times, I'm canceling my subscription because I don't like your foreign affairs coverage. My advice to those of you who are interested in following this tact is not to focus on Israel at the outset, but rather to focus on, in general, I'm not getting accurate reports from the LA Times on the issues that interest me, whether it's China or Korea or India or Saudi Arabia or Iran or Iraq or Burma or what have you. And by the way, also Israel. I don't think I'm getting the whole story. All of our activities should be done smarter and more focused. And that brings me back to this issue of ensuring that when you do write a letter to, and it's another, take the political realm aside from the media. When you write a letter to your congressperson, today, the way everything is electronic, you can bet that even if your congressman or woman doesn't actually read the letter itself, I know for a fact, having heard this from 5 or 6 different congresspeople and senators, their staff collates weekly summaries. You've had 175 letters on this particular issue. 75% are in favor and 25% are against. That kind of thing. Because that's the way we work today. Your letters do count. But you have to make them count by ensuring that they are focused and concise, and that they dwell specifically and focus not just on whatever the particular issue is that you're advocating for, but also reinforcing this issue of the legitimacy of Israel and the Jewish return to our ancestral homeland as the indigenous people. I'm going to close there because it's late and we're tired. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for being here tonight. I'm happy to stick around for some more questions and answers. Thank you for all of our sponsors, and Aryeh, thank you for organizing.